Welcome everybody to a workshop on forming partnerships within the dynamic framework. So what we're doing here today, we're trying to explore how partnerships can best be formed within the context of the dynamic framework. To do that, we're going to do two main things. One is kind of presentation and question and answer. So I will be talking through some slides on what we know about the dynamic framework. It won't be as full a thing as I think some of you were probably on the workshop a couple of weeks ago that were run between CLINCS and HMPPS on the dynamic framework, but we'll try and summarize the position as far as we know. I'll then talk about how you might prepare for partnership within that and how you might build partnerships within that. So first thing, the dynamic framework. Again, you may all know this, but it's good to kind of set the foundation of what we're trying to talk about. And the first thing I'm going to say, and this workshop is probably the most complicated one in an already complicated process, because deeply aware that for Greater Manchester colleagues, the situation is different again because of devolution. So what we're going to do is I'm going to just run through this context that we do for, if you like, all the normal regions. So all of this is definitely relevant for Northwest. Some of it is relevant for Greater Manchester, but of course Greater Manchester, we don't quite know the details, are not going to be doing their commissioning through the dynamic framework. So what I'm going to do is run through this as if I normally would for a normal region, and then we're actually going to pause for a moment, and Ange from the Northwest perspective is going to just talk about the Greater Manchester difference, and we'll have a chat about that for a while, and just because it is more complicated because of the devolution issue. So dynamic framework. What do we know? It's a two-stage process. The two stages are qualification, and you need to qualify to show expertise in the relevant service need area, of which there are 14, and indicate geography. After qualification, there's going to be a rolled out program of call-offs of specific service contracts, which will combine different service needs in different ways in specific areas. We don't quite know what the full timetable is of, that's an understatement, we don't know at all what the timetable is of call-offs. It's to be announced. They have said that it will start with ETE, Education, Training, Employment, in mid-August, and be followed with at least a 3-week gap by accommodation, then personal wellbeing, and then women's services. And then the other areas will be called off from there. Timing-wise, it's tight. You need to qualify for a particular area that you want to bid for at least 30 days before a call-off is announced. So for ETE especially, if that is going to be called off in mid-August, then you need to qualify by mid-July, which is only a couple of weeks away now. The time from call-off being announced to the bid submission is not known either. It will be a minimum of 4 weeks, they've said. I mean, knowing statutory commissioners, minimum usually means that's what it's going to be, but we don't know. It could be longer. And of course, within all of that tight time frame, what you need to know as quickly as possible is what's going to be in the service spec. You won't know the precise detail until the call-off comes out. There is some service specification information available already on the Jaeger portal. There's a 68-page document on there that outlines some of the service specs, so good to get hold of that as quickly as possible. Day one services, i.e. the key services to start June 2021. So those 4 areas that are up there, ETE, accommodation, personal wellbeing, and women's services, they're commissioned centrally by HMPPS, others by regional probation directors, with the caveat here that just different again in Greater Manchester. Okay, so as I say, 14 service areas, and call-offs will group the services into multi-service category lots. Geography is complicated anyway without the Greater Manchester issue. Some of the services are commissioned by NPS region. So the first 2, ETE and accommodation, are commissioned by NPS region. Some, and in terms of the day one services, the wellbeing and the women's services, will be commissioned by PCC area. And as it rolls out, I think the likelihood is that more services will be commissioned by PCC area, but we don't know for certain how that's going to happen. The contract values are going to vary massively. The values we've got there are for specific service area needs in specific areas, which of course they might be grouped together. So the smallest is 12k, but the smallest contract will probably be bigger than that, but it's still going to be pretty small to very big. You know, you can assume that there will be a huge variance in the contract values. And contract lengths, they don't know, they haven't said 2 to 4 years. And obviously I think most people would think that the longer the better, and a contract of 2 years would present challenges to lots of people. So key thing to say about partnership development, and then we'll, in this context, and then we'll stop and talk about Greater Manchester for a moment, is, you know, how do you put partnerships together when you don't know what it is quite yet that the call-off's going to say, and the timing's tight? The clear recommendation at this stage is to get qualified as an individual organisation in the areas that you're interested in. You may end up being a subcontractor, you may end up being all sorts of things that maybe you in the end didn't need to have qualified, but if you qualify as an individual organisation, you're increasing your options. It means you can engage in the call-offs as they come out. You're not reliant on anybody else or another partner in that. So probably best, if you can, to qualify as an individual organisation in the areas that you want, that you think you might be interested in. For some, of course, that won't be possible. Supply chain organisations, we know, have difficulties there because you need to qualify by showing experience in service delivery, and supply chain organisations don't have any of those, that direct service delivery. So they will need to qualify with a subcontractor already. And obviously, if you're a very small organisation, you might not want to qualify. You might trust your relationships with bigger organisations who you know will want to subcontract you, and you'll let them get on with the qualification. But in most cases, it's probably best to try and qualify as an individual organisation. I'm going to stop sharing for the moment. And Ange, do you want to tell us what you know about Greater Manchester? Not everything you know about Greater Manchester.
Not everything.
You know, just commissioning in this current, yeah.
So, and this has been a very quick decision. So some GM organisations may already have heard around this. However, Greater Manchester were given the option to not procure through the dynamic framework for probation services. One of the reasons it's become its own probation area is because obviously the devolution agenda with justice in Greater Manchester that has been there for the last 5 years now. So they've got a lot of robust processes in place already with regards to co-commissioning. And the whole point of this probation reform, in the long-term aim, is to have those co-commissioning relationships. So within Greater Manchester, so co-commission services through Greater Manchester Combined Authority, National Probation Service, prisons, and other partners, health, NHS. So they've already got sort of their commissioning processes in place. That's not to say they've got the services in place, because they haven't. It just means they're not going through the dynamic framework. However, they still at this stage don't know how they're going to look, and it's still a work in progress because it is a very quick decision that they've made. So they're currently looking through the service specs as it stands. There will still be contracting day one services from June 2021, but they may also look at commissioning of other services within the dynamic framework that don't have to be day one before the next call off, if you like, the call off for the day 2 or day 3 or future services, whatever we want to call them. So GM are going to be doing some more work with Clinks around some partnership events going forward, to look at what that might mean, especially for smaller organisations as well within that, and bringing people together. So like I say, it's still very much uncertain how it's going to work. They're still ironing out all those details, but they've decided to not go through the national framework and do it at a GM level, which is a positive, and it's something that they want, and HMPPS MOJ want other areas to follow lead on when it comes to sort of those PCC area funding for, say, the Northwest going forward, and those co-commission structures. So what I would still say is, because we haven't had any clarification on this, is to still, if you're in GM and you're going and you're looking for a GM contract only, I would still say to qualify in the framework, because it may be that the regional probation director for that area and GMCA will look on that framework anyway, it just won't be procured on that. But if your name and details are on there, that, you know, that would be my advice at this stage. If you're interested in one of those contract locks, get yourself on there anyway, and then we'll wait for GM. I know it's a process, you know, ongoing process, and it may be something that you don't have to do. And obviously if I hear anything else, because I know there's another meeting at the end of this week with GM, if I hear there's anything different, I will keep you all updated as to how that's progressing. But they will be moving pretty quickly in getting some sort of network information out there, and trying to look at funding of what organisations may need, if it's capacity building, etc., to try and bring those partnerships together.
Thanks, Ange. So I guess one of the questions is timing. If the DF call off for ETE is mid-August, Greater Manchester are going to have to try and mirror some of that timing close to, aren't they? Because they still need to get the services in place in the same time frame. Yeah,
definitely. So they will still be looking to all the contracts to start June 2021 for day one services. It's just how they will commission and contract that rather than the framework. And that's the only thing that we know is different at the minute.
Okay, thanks, Ange. I'm gonna zap back to, well, actually, we might as well tell her where will the information for GM be coming from?
So, Siobhan, I'm currently working with GMCA Justice Leads and Chris Edwards, the Regional Probation Director, to try and glean that information, and I'm having regular meetings with them. So I'm going to feed back to GMCA today after this, sort of based on what we hear today around partnerships, and also we've got a feedback form afterwards about what further information what further support you need from Clinks in this, and now we'll be putting that forward to GM as well to say that this is what people will need. So I'll sort of be the point of contact, I suppose, with those. But I mean, if you have got relationships directly with them, please feel free to ask them the questions. But I'm happy to field any questions through to them if people do want to email me, and I'll put my email address in the chat box for those of you who don't have it or don't know me. Then and we can field our questions through to them and get them back to you. Does that sound okay, Siobhan? I can't see you.
Okay.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Ange.
Thanks.
Okay. All right. I'm going to go back to the sharing the presentation. Hopefully that's worked for everybody. Rosie, tell me if it hasn't. Has that worked?
Yes.
Great. Thank you. Okay. So that's what we broadly know. It's funny, we kind of know more about the Northwest or the regions than we do Greater Manchester, and given how sort of little we know about the DF as it is, it feels strange to say there's an area where we know even less, but that is the case at the moment. Okay, so just to acknowledge that in terms of developing partnerships within the DF, it's not ideal. Timing is tight, specific service content's not known. This is not an ideal environment for developing partnerships. Also acknowledge that we're in a world of COVID, so that causes difficulties for everybody, from commissioners, clinks to potential suppliers. None of us can do the normal meeting and cups of coffee and stuff that we would normally do to form partnerships. And in any case, you know, this isn't an ideal, perfect world for partnership development. One of the things we do quite a lot of is working with organisations to develop their partnership strategy. And the first question we ask isn't, so what are you going to apply for then? You know, there is a world where partnerships are put together in a way that isn't funding led, that is about mission and beneficiary need, a mutual benefit in that way. But that's not the world we're in here. Second thing to say, though, is even in the real world, where partnerships are often put together in order to meet commissioning need, it's not an ideal real world scenario either. We still don't know all the detail that we need, and there's not a lot of time to put these things together, especially in the early call-offs. So, you know, mid-July to qualify, mid-August the call-off comes out. And 2 to 4 years is a long time to be in the wrong partnership. That said, that's the cards we're dealt, and that's what everybody's going to have to grapple with. So partnerships will need to come together. We're saying that, you know, there's a spectrum of different possible partnerships, from informal, sharing best practice, policy work, information exchange, through to formal, usually where some money is changing hands, so sharing back office functions, buying services together, or co-designing services, through to contractual, which are the two we're mainly going to talk about today. So lead entity and subcontractor, or prime and subcontractor as it's often known, so a supply chain, or a contractual arrangement with a consortia, and in this case it has to be via a special purpose vehicle, so an entity that's created by the consortium members to sign up to the contract or to bid for the contract. The ultimate partnership, it's worth saying, is merger. We're not going to be talking about merger here today either. Most of my day job is charity mergers, so if you do have a merger in the offing, well, first thing to say is I wouldn't merge just to meet the dynamic framework specifications. Timing would be far too tight for that. Secondly, if you do have questions about merger, I'm quite happy for people to email me separately. Okay, so we are concentrating on the contractual partnerships. It's not to say other partnerships aren't useful, but it's the contractual ones that will be most likely to be the game changers. The last thing to say in context is, look, HMPPS have said in their market warming and in the workshops they've been in that they're keen to promote the use of partnerships. They've said it in these are the market warming slides they've sent out, all the benefits of consortia set out. But it's true to say, and when we ask them specifically, there's no extra points in any bid for being in a partnership. You don't get brownie points or extra points. So being in a partnership will only be a means to an end, i.e. better service for beneficiaries, more likely to get through the tender process. It's not an end in itself in this process. And that's an important thing to think about when putting partnerships together. Okay, so what's the process to go through to put together a partnership? We tend to think of it as a five key questions to ask. Deeply aware that these are, you know, in an ideal world, you might be theoretically asking yourselves these questions in a darkened room with lots of time to answer them. And actually, given the nature of the dynamic framework, these things are going to be bouncing around in different ways as you're talking to potential partners. But it's still useful, I think, to think of the 5 questions that need to be addressed as an organisation when developing a partnership. Number 1, and I'd say a huge amount of feedback from our design buddies was the first one is, do you want to be part of the dynamic framework in the first place? Key question to ask before you even start thinking about which partnerships you might be in. If you do, what will you be doing in it and why? Then do you need partners and why? Then who should the partner be? And then what type of partnership should that be? Should it be a consortia? Should it be a lead entity process? I'm just going to unpack those questions a little bit. So do you want to be part of the dynamic framework? Crucial question to ask. It's always, you know, statutory funding is a question for all charities to ask whether they want to engage in that world. Will it help them? Will it help you achieve your mission? Can you do it? Does it fit your values? Will, by delivering these services, will you be asked to do things operationally that are comfortable and in terms of your service approach and that butt up against your values? Does it make financial sense? Will all these common questions, will there really be full cost recovery? Everybody says there's full cost recovery, but the reality is that statutory contracts are often subsidized. Do you have the capacity to engage in the process of the dynamic framework itself, putting together partnerships? All of that takes time and resource, and there may be opportunity costs to that. There may be better things you could be doing with that time. That said, aware that for many organisations, especially smaller ones, sometimes statutory commissioning contracts, it's the only game in town. It's 80–90% of your funding, and really it tips it heavily in the balance of yes, we do need to engage in this, despite concerns we might have about the earlier questions. Another question to ask is the rapid growth and shrinkage that statutory contracts can bring. I used to run an organisation that had a turnover of £20 million, but it was from 3 Home Office contracts. So at any one moment, depending on when they ended, we could have been a £500,000 organisation. I say at one moment, but in our 9 months in the future, if we'd lost all of our contracts at once. That kind of growth and shrinkage is very difficult to plan strategically around. And is that a world you really want to be in the long term? So key questions to ask. Do you want to be part of this dynamic framework to start with? If you do, then in partnership world, we talk about value proposition. What is it you're bringing to the framework and any potential partnership? What service can you provide? What are your strengths in relation to the contract requirements, and what's your weaknesses? Just important to be aware of those things going into any negotiations. And where are your boundaries and red lines? There'll be financial boundaries in terms of your minimum costs for things, but also in terms of scale of management fee, etc. And there's questions of values when you're working in partnership. Voluntary sector organisations have very strong ideologies, quite rightly, about how they believe the best way to work with beneficiaries are. And some of those ideologies can be very different between different charities. It's what gives us our diversity as a sector. That's great. But it's very difficult to work closely in partnership with an organisation that just has a very different way of approaching the work with your beneficiaries than you do. So those are questions to be clear about and know in your own mind before entering partnerships. And then third question, do you need partners and why? Something that came up quite heavily with design buddies was, look, really got to be sure the contract value merits a partnership. The example was given from one of our design buddies that said they started with a consortia of 7 organisations, but it was for a contract value that shook down to 10 posts. And it just wasn't worth the candle for anybody, the amount of work that went into forming that partnership and maintaining it for, in some cases, less than a post each. So important to match your partnership scale to the value of the contract. Ask yourself the key questions. How will a partnership enhance your services for your beneficiaries? How will a partnership enhance your chances of being commissioned? Those two can be very different questions. Good to know the answer to both of them for you. As I've said, where are your boundaries and red lines in your partnership, in your approach to partnership, and within that, which issues are absolute and what will you be prepared to flex about? And I think one of the important things about all of these questions is it's really helpful to have an organizational view about those things, not just an individual person view, both because you'll really annoy potential partners if you keep changing your mind about things, and good to know what you think to start with, but B, what you don't want to do is to engage in all sorts of negotiations with potential partners and then go back to your board and for them to say, well, no, actually we have this value problem or this operational problem that we can't agree with what you've been saying or negotiating. So if you can agree the answers to all 3 of these questions, do you want to be involved? What are you going to do? Who do you want to partner? Why do you want to partner? Think about those as an organisation before engaging in talking to partners. And make the obvious point, the answer to these questions will change and may change as more information is found out about the call-off specifically and what's in their service spec. Okay, having decided that you want to be involved and this is what you want to do, and you definitely want to have partners, who should the partners be? It's a project in itself. In an ideal world, you'll be able to draw up some sort of framework for assessing partners, asking yourself key questions. Do they offer what you need? What's their culture and values? Do they fit? What do you know of their service quality? What do you know of their financials? Do they have a history of partnership working? Might be different questions for you in an assessment framework, but those are some ideas. And the other thing to say is that, really research them, even if you know them. Even if know in inverted commas, because you might know you might be you know, have coffee with their chief executive or feel you know them, but really research them. Charity Commission website for financials, their website, Google them to see if they've got scandals or anything that you haven't heard about in their history. Google their people blogged around anything that would be of interest. Your staff, if they've worked for a potential partner, will be a goldmine of information about that potential partner. And they will know very much on the ground how it is that they actually deliver services or actually feel. And colleagues in other organisations that you know and trust and may have worked with potential partners, can you tap them for any information? So find out as much as you can about your list of potential partners and try and rank them into a preferred, possible and not, and make it a process essentially. And agree key questions and information you still need about each option. Okay, and then the last question of the 5 is coming to some view about kind of what type of partnership you're up for. Lead entity, subcontractor, or thinking about a consortia. Arguably, actually, this is the least relevant question and could be thrashed out when you know who your partners might be and exactly what they may look like. But obviously, lots of organisations going into this will want to be clear, you know, and will be clear, do you know what, we're not going to do this unless we're the lead, or we're not going to do this unless we're approaching it as part of a consortia. But having said that, and this slide sort of sets out the difference between those two vehicles, the next slide, if you like, will talk about actually the reality on the ground can be that, well, it can be that the reality is very different, and can be very, basically what I'm saying is that these structures can be quite irrelevant to actually how the partnership feels on the ground. And the next slide will talk about this. But this slide, for what it's worth, is clearly about all the differences between the two. So, and many of you will know this, but just to say, lead entity, quite obvious, somebody signing up with HMPPS and managing a supply chain. In theory, in terms of complexity and capacity, the greatest complexity and capacity is for the lead entity. The subcontractor, in theory, it's a simpler process. You're just taking a contract from a lead entity. Whereas in a consortia, you're forming with your partners a separate organisation to take on the contract. And that will come with different forms of complexity and responsibility, because no matter what your part of the contract is as the consortium member, you're in charge of the SPV, the special purpose vehicle, or part of the control of that has a responsibility for the entire contract. Ultimate risk and responsibility obviously sits in a lead entity and subcontract with the lead entity, whereas the subcontractor only has to worry, in theory, about their bit of the contract, whereas the consortia, well, it's across the whole contract. And winding up these partnership structures, in theory, simpler for a lead and subcontractor arrangement, because when the contract ends, so does that arrangement. Important thing to remember with a consortia is that it's created, the SPV is created, and even when the contract's gone, that will still be in place. So that SPV may have developed assets and liabilities throughout its life. It's a thing that still exists and still needs managing. But, you know, as an overall picture, you know, lead entities, that's the most responsibility, right? Most control. Subcontractor, well, the deal is you're not in charge, but you know, there's a sense of which you negotiate, but you have to take what you're given, take what you're told. Consortia, in theory, much more collegiate. You're able to share and negotiate with your partners about how things are done and how the contract is delivered. However, I think another key message from our design buddies is that actually the partnership type, that type of model, actually isn't often the most important question. It is true to say that there are consortias out there where the members feel completely not at all engaged, responsible, or in charge. The minor players just feel just like a subcontractor. It's also true to say that there are plenty of lead and subcontractor relationships that feel more collegiate and more equal. I used to be in a couple of these in the refugee sector where, for pragmatic reasons, mainly to do with timing, which I think is relevant here, we decided that one of our number of partners would formally take on the lead entity role, and we would be the subcontractors. But actually the way we managed the partnership and the delivery was very much on a consortia basis. We shared everything, we shared decisions, we delegated who was going to areas of decision making. So my organisation was responsible for the services and the service quality. Another one was responsible for sort of publicity and all of that kind of thing, and another one was responsible for the money side. And so we shared it out, even though there was technically a legal lead entity in the partnership. Ultimately, then, a few things to say. Regardless of what partnership type you have, if you're one of the smaller players in it in terms of the contract value, you're always going to have less control and say over how it's run. And if you're one of the players for whom that contract represents an awful lot of your income, 80–90% of your income, everybody will know that, and will know that you haven't got walkaway rights, and so we'll know, and so will inevitably you've got less of a negotiation and bargaining position. What all that means is that ultimately partnership structure is arguably less relevant than, you know, trust, shared mission, shared values, and good relationships. Do you get on? Can you share? Can you trust the people you're in the partnership with? And those things are more important than the actual partnership structure. Okay. So, in an ideal world, before you even go out and talk to potential partners, you've got an organisational view on these questions. You've agreed you want to be part of the DF, clear about what you want to do, clear on why you want to partner. You've got a ranked list of possible partners, and you've got an initial position on what your preferred partnership structure might be. Obviously, in the real world, those questions will be revolving, and there'll be things that you find out that will change the answer to them. And as you start to talk to partners, those will change as well. In terms of informally building partners, that's where, you know, hopefully the next session will start some of that. Formal approaches, conversations, important to be really clear about your value proposition, what you can do, what your boundaries and red lines are, gather the information you need, and all the time assessing the people. Are these people that you can work with? So that you can go back to the ranch and re-rank the possible partnership options and agree who to work with formally. Just a few things about formal side of building partners. Again, partnerships, again, most of this is probably well known to you. But just to say, at some point, if you're going to develop a partnership within any commissioning framework, but the dynamic framework no different, there'll be an NDA, a non-disclosure agreement, essentially a document that says you won't be sharing information that you get from your partner or partners with anybody else, because that information is obviously commercially sensitive. Make sure that it is mutual, that everyone's signing up to it, and make sure it is just an NDA. Sometimes NDAs are released and they're kind of other things in the NDA other than just non-disclosure. But one of the main things that's often in it is an exclusivity agreement, i.e., you know, we're signing an NDA and we're only going to work with each other on this potential bid and contract. HMPPS have ruled out exclusivity agreements in this process. So if you're particularly relevant for smaller organisations that may want to be part of many more than one bid for the same service, that's absolutely allowed. And in fact, the lead contractors are not allowed to insist on exclusivity. A couple of things to say at this stage about the other market protections that Clinks have certainly worked hard to talk to HMPPS about doing stuff around bid candy, i.e. the idea that lead contractors may agree all sorts of subcontracts to get through the commissioning for the tender process, and then the subcontractors find that their services are no longer needed as the contract goes on. So HMPPS has said there's going to be an annual report on subcontractors, and that leads can't change subcontractors, or at least key subcontractors, without permission. We don't know at this stage exactly what that means, what key subcontractor means, and quite what the report will involve, but there are at least some indications of protection for smaller subcontractors around the issue of bid candy. Okay. Finally then, when you're developing partners and you've agreed you want to go for this with a particular set of partners, you need a partnership framework. And when I was originally putting these slides together, I sort of made an attempt at one that was for the kind of putting a bid together stage and one that was for the delivery. But actually, you'll need these things in place and need to start thinking about these things in order even to put a bid together. You'll need to know how you're going to work together for the longer term in order to do the short-term business of putting a bid together. So any partnership needs a framework, whether it's a consortia or a lead and a subcontractor. People need to know how they're going to work together. The sorts of things that should be in a partnership framework: governance and strategy. What's the partnership for? What's its mission? What's it trying to achieve in life? And importantly, having agreed that, how are you going to keep on top of that? What's your structure, your leadership structure for keeping an eye on whether this partnership is doing what it said it was going to do on the tin? Agree risks, key risks to the partnership and what it wants to achieve, and how those risks can be mitigated. There's obviously a whole world of operations around any partnership in relation to statutory contracting, not just how is the bid going to get written and how it's designed, but how is the delivery going to be done? You know, how many people hours for a certain task will there be? What's our process around X, Y, and Z? Those key questions need thrashing out, and it needs to be very clear who is doing the operational design and keeping an oversight over the delivery. Resourcing was a big challenge in a partnership, not just how they're distributed, you know, how quickly they're distributed, who's getting what management fee, but also, as I'll come on to, how is the partnership funded in itself? How are any structures that the partnership needs to survive going to be funded? How is that creamed off? Those things are always very controversial and difficult to agree, but need nailing. And then service quality and impact measurement. Not just the challenge across the partnership of agreeing what those measurements are, which might be different to just in pure terms what the commissioner wants. The partnership itself might agree some other service quality and impact measurements, but the challenge of agreeing how to monitor those things, how often, and bringing together different organisations, monitoring and quality systems, different databases, different service logging forms, all of those things is something that needs agreeing. Within those, and you know, there'll be other things within a framework that are important to you, but I think those are some of the key things. Within all of that, you need to agree who leads what. How is it agreed who leads what? But somebody needs to be in charge, and I stress again, especially even within a consortia, people need to know who's in charge of what. How will the parties communicate? What structures will be in place? Literally, you know, how often are we going to meet at each level is important to thrash out. Who decides? How decisions are made? And who coordinates? You know, a partnership of any scale and any length will probably start to want to think about the central posts for that partnership it might need. It might need a finance post to work out the finances, or a quality and impact measuring post, or an entire team, a secretariat to coordinate the partnership. And as I say, questions about what that does and how it's resourced can be very controversial within a partnership and needs thrashing out. And then finally, how will disagreements and disputes be solved? What's the process for doing that, and how's that fed up the partnership management chain? Okay. Final word about legal and contracts. I mean, we're not going deep into contracts and things in this, but important to say, I think for consortias, best advice is to agree as much as you can before going to the lawyers. If you go at an early stage to lawyers and say we want to form a consortia, they will charge you to design your consortia and how you want the framework to work at expensive lawyerly rates. So agree as much as you can about the framework and how you want to be, and then go to the lawyers to say, can you advise us on the best vehicle to use and how to put this together. Subcontractors, obviously, you should use solicitors to review any contract you're given. I've never used a lawyer to review a contract and fed everything that the lawyer has said up to the lead contractor. There's always a judgment that needs to be made, because lawyers, as we know, will give you 180% of every possible risk, and you need to make your own judgment about what it is that's worth negotiating with the lead contractor or not. Goes without saying, lead contractors have a responsibility to issue fair and transparent subcontracts to their subcontractors, and also listen and hear and negotiate with any changes needed. And then final point just to make is that obviously consortias and lead contractors all have a duty to appropriately negotiate their primary contract, a duty to their supply chain to do that, to HMPPS, but also a duty to their beneficiaries to negotiate the best possible contract with HMPPS. Okay, just some final thoughts from our mixture of us and our design buddies around building partnerships. Resourcing just came up all the time. The not underestimating how much resource keep putting a partnership together and keeping it together makes, and to keep it simple, because every layer of partnership, every subcontractor that's subcontracting a subcontractor is another layer of bureaucracy and another layer of potential management fee that just takes money from the front line. And that point again about not underestimating the capacity to coordinate around monitoring because of different organizational systems. Quite a lot of advice about how to have a positive partnership. The point again about relationships and working well with people, and can you trust them? Will you enjoy working with them? But an interesting point I thought from one of our design buddies about the responsibility that charity leaders have, or organizational leaders have, around a partnership, to present internally to their organization reasonably, but a positive view to the partnership rather than a negative one. So in other words, not as this person was saying this, I knew I'd definitely done this, not going to a partnership meeting and then going back to the ranch, to your organization with your team and going, oh God, they really are driving me mad. They're just idiots, every single one of them. You know, that kind of negative representation of your partners internally within your organization is not going to help the partnership to survive and prosper. Related to that is the idea that a partnership should be invested in at all levels, not just at management level. I've certainly seen this where the senior teams of organizations consider the partnership to be very successful because they're the ones going to the away days around the partnership, and it's all great at that level. But the people doing the work, either on the front line that are working together or in the back office, finance workers trying to work together, who haven't had the same level of investment in the partnership, haven't had the away day to tell them what the partnership's about, what it's trying to achieve and what the hurdles might be, they're the ones not getting on so well because the investment haven't been there. Okay, and finally, you know, the idea that all partnerships will have difference and therefore potentially tension within them because they're partnerships of difference, right? They're different organizations that are different in scope, different in size, different in geography, and all of those things can cause tension. But trying to hold on to the fact, well, you know, it's those differences that are enriching and making the partnership better, helping us deliver our services to our beneficiaries, rather than finding the negatives in those differences. Okay, and then final thoughts about three different areas, if you like. Good consortia has a shared sense of mission and values. Its members feel engaged, but it still has a very clear idea about who's in charge of what. Good lead contractor, definitely in charge, but works with its subcontractors to define a shared sense of mission and values and ensures that its subcontractors feel engaged. And then the other side of that is a good subcontractor, of course, is assertive and clear and transparent about what it brings to the partnership and involves itself in the decision making, but has to accept as a subcontractor that it isn't the final decision maker. And then finally, to round off, two quotes that we heard as we talked to design buddies and others. First one, a voluntary sector partnership is the putting aside of mutual loathing in order to get money. And then the other side of that, the voluntary sector is good at partnership. Charities want to do the best thing for their beneficiaries. And if that requires a partnership, they will approach that with professionalism, goodwill, generosity, and transparency. I suspect the truth is often somewhere in the middle. But obviously the nearer you can get to a partnership that's founded and has its foundations on the second quote than the first, probably the better you'll do in terms of tackling the dynamic framework, but certainly the better you'll do in terms of delivering quality services to beneficiaries. Thank you ever so much for your time. I hope that was useful and go well as you attempt to tackle it. Thanks ever so much.